The topic for this unit in the legacy of Greece and Rome is the third of the great 5th century BCE tragedians, namely Euripides. We've spent time, as you recall, with the oldest of the three, Aeschylus, a poet who fought in the Persian Wars, stood at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. Sophocles, whose Oedipus Rex we just studied, was born probably about 6-7 years before the Battle of Marathon. So as a child, he would have heard about it, and he most assuredly would have been very well acquainted with the great Battle of Salamis, which took place 10 years later. And Euripides, however, born in probably about 485 BCE, is less acquainted with that pivotal era in Greek history. We're going to be talking a little bit about the intellectual and social and political forces that would have been at work in the 5th century BCE as Euripides reached his maturity. But for now, I want to turn to the two plays that we looked at in particular. And if you'll indulge me for starting with a little note of high drama, I want to just pause for a moment on the enduring impact of Euripides' play, the Medea, which you have now read. This picture comes from a performance in London just a few years ago, and it just captures in a moment the brooding, dramatic, psychological study of Medea in all of her rage. I want you to hold this thought in mind because it is one of the hallmarks of Euripides, really probing into the character, the emotional and mental dynamics of the characters in his tragedies, much more so than we saw in Sophocles, and particularly much more than we saw in Aeschylus. Those two tragedians focused much more on both the plot and the personae, the somewhat abstract figures who move in the tragedy, whereas Euripides gives us much more attention into the inner workings of the minds of his characters. So now back to the life of Euripides and a brief overview, putting these plays in perspective. So as I said, born about 485 BCE, 5 years after the Battle of Marathon, give or take a little bit because the birth is uncertain, died with somewhat more certainty around 406 BCE, very close to the demise of Athens in the Peloponnesian War, a topic that we will be taking up very soon as we read Thucydides. He won a victory with the Hippolytus in 428 BCE, which we're going to be talking about in just a few moments in this unit. He won posthumously in the great tragic competitions with his play The Bacchae and Iphigenia at Aulis, the latter of which, of course, you read in connection with the story of the Oresteia. Of the 92, or probably 92 plays that he wrote, 19 of them survive. The Medea, which is the first play we're going to talk about in detail, was performed in 431 BCE. That, you will remember, is the outbreak of the Peloponnesian War, and that may to some degree have influenced the way he shaped the plot. The comic playwright Aristophanes, whose plays, at least some of his plays we have come down to us, brilliant, bawdy, unrestrained comedies that they are, makes pretty relentless fun of Euripides. He is a character that's easy to caricature because of his probing into the psychology, particularly the psychology of women. And Aristophanes really did seem to enjoyed always poking fun at authority figures or people who were notorious in Athenian social or political life. And he does make quite a lot of fun of Euripides and has a lot of fun with the Euripidean characters in his comedies. Albin Lesky, the author of the rather magisterial History of Greek Literature, really focuses us very well on the issue with Euripides. Hardly any figure in ancient literature is so hard to comprehend in as many aspects as Euripides. And we're going to hold on to that thought because we're going to see a mixture of the old and the new, and certainly an author who was willing to push the boundaries. He grew up in the heyday of Athenian intellectuals, Socrates, Protagoras, Hippias, many of the sophists, these wandering intellectuals who kept so much of Athenian life in a real rich intellectual ferment. And when we see, for example, in the Hippolytus, a phrase like "gods should be wiser than men," it's not too much of a stretch to realize that that's coming right out of that period in Athens when people are questioning received beliefs. And Euripides brings these things onto the stage. To understand the Medea, we need to go back a little ways into the mythology of the story on which it's based. The story of Jason and the Argonauts, perhaps known to you from many retellings in children's books. The story is extremely old. In fact, Homer in the Odyssey speaks of it as the Argo known to all people. In other words, already a very well-established story by the time the Odyssey takes its shape. And in the fifth book of the Odyssey, there's a strange story of a character named Iason, who is the mortal lover of Demeter, the goddess. The elements of this ancient story are these. Peleus, and that's not Peleus, the father of Achilles, but Peleus lusts for power in Thessaly. He banishes his rivals and he locks his own uncle Aeson in a dungeon. Peleus is a ruthless tyrant. He kills a suppliant in a temple of Hera, which of course is going to earn the goddess's unremitting hostility, and that's going to be one of the dynamics in the story of Jason. He kills children who might be rivals for the throne, so Aeson sends his son Jason off to Chiron, the wise centaur, half man, half horse, who is the tutor of many of the great heroes in their youth. Now, Peleus had gotten a prophecy that he would one day be supplanted by a man with one sandal, and sure enough, one day Jason appears, and he had lost that sandal as he carried an old woman begging him to take her over a flooding stream. That old woman turned out to be none but the goddess Hera in disguise. Hence, Peleus has earned the goddess's unremitting hostility, and Jason has earned her unwavering fidelity and assistance. And if you magnify your screen and look at the figure in the lower left-hand corner of this Roman fresco from Pompeii, you will see that that figure is standing with only one sandal as King Peleus up on the steps looks on in dismay. Pompeii, you will recall, was covered with volcanic ash in the explosion of Mount Vesuvius. Hence, we have some really wonderfully preserved Roman frescoes and a lot of other extremely important monuments of antiquity. Now, Peleus, trying to prevent his doom, and by now you must realize that nobody ever manages that in Greek mythology, but trying to prevent his doom, he asks this stranger, none other than Jason, what would he do if the oracle said he would be murdered by a fellow citizen? And Jason said, send him to bring back the golden fleece. Now, the golden fleece is hanging from a tree in the wild land of Colchis. So a voyage is likely to prove fatal to begin with, and the person who arrives and tries to get the golden fleece is likely to perish in the attempt. So Jason has actually bumbled into a particularly difficult situation. Those of you who are lovers of Tolkien will remember the story of the Silmarillion when Beren says to the father of Luthien that he will go and fetch a Silmaril from the crown of Morgoth, and says to her father, you elves must hold your daughters cheap if you would think that that's a suitable price for one so fair as Luthien. Tolkien, of course, a brilliant scholar, professor of English at Oxford, might well have been thinking of just this moment as he framed that wonderful love story, one of the greatest love stories ever written. If you haven't read it, the love story of Beren and Luthien, but I am getting off my subject here. So Argos, who is the son of Phrixus, who actually rode the golden ram all the way to Colchis, Argos builds the ship, the Argo, the magic ship, and Athena, the goddess, fits it with a plank that has the gift of speech. And it is manned by the ancient legion of superheroes, Orpheus, Castor and Pollux, Meleager, Heracles, Theseus, many others. The tale rather grew in the telling, to borrow another phrase from J.R.R. Tolkien. Well, Jason arrives after many exciting adventures, and he goes to King Aeetes, who's none other than the son of the sun, Helios, and has all kinds of magical powers and tricks, and says, I've come here to collect the golden fleece. And Aeetes is not particularly amused and says, well, yeah, your little task you have to do first. I have a pair of magic bulls made of brass. They snort fire and do all kinds of other things that make them hard to control. They were a gift to me from Hephaestus. And when you've managed to yoke them and plow the field, you sow them with the teeth of the dragon, the same dragon that Cadmus slew in Thebes. And that, of course, will mean that warriors spring up. It's not looking very good for our hero. So Hera, who you remember loves Jason, and Athena, who's also very dedicated to him, persuade Aphrodite to make the princess Medea fall in love with Jason. And she is a sorceress, otherwise known as a witch, happens to be very beautiful, but also very dangerous. And she makes a potion to protect him from the fire-breathing bulls. And then she helps him steal the golden fleece from the dragon that guards it by putting it to sleep. And here is a wonderful pre-Raphaelite painting by John William Waterhouse of Medea mixing the potion for the hero Jason. These stories were, of course, richly illustrated in Athenian vase painting. There is the goddess Athena helping pathetic-looking Jason as he's taking the golden fleece off of the tree on which it hangs. This touching love story becomes really quite ugly as we read in some of the other Greek texts that talk about it. Elements of the story are picked up in Euripides' tragedy. If you read carefully, you'll see how some of these details are raised in the consciousness of the viewer or readers as we are now. In order to escape from her father, they hightail it out of Colchis, and to slow up the chase, Medea takes her own brother Apsyrtus, cuts him into pieces, and throws the pieces into the sea so the grieving father will collect them for burial. And then she needs to be purified by none other than her aunt Circe, another one of those rather terrifying figures. Circe surfaces obviously in the Odyssey, where she turns the crew of Odysseus into pigs, and he, with the help of the gods, forces her to turn them back into men, and they become lovers for a year, and she gives him instructions about how to go on in his voyage. These children or relatives of the sun are rather dangerous individuals. And Orpheus on board saves the ship from the sirens, and they go past the wandering rocks, and they go to the magical land of Phaeacia, where they enjoy a shotgun wedding so that Alcinous the king won't be forced to return Medea to the war party from Colchis that is still chasing them down. Medea helps Jason escape from Talus, the brazen giant on the island of Crete. And then she does something even more problematic, which certainly does enter into the story of the Medea as Euripides tells us. They get back to the court of King Peleus, and Jason says, here is the golden fleece. I have performed my duty. Aeetes is not particularly amused at all of this. I'm sorry, I said Aeetes, I meant to say Peleus. Peleus is not amused to see Jason back and alive. And things are getting a little tense in the palace. So Medea performs a magic trick for the daughters of Peleus. Peleus is getting on in years. She takes an elderly ram and cuts it into pieces and throws it into a boiling cauldron with some herbs, and it jumps out, a little spring lamb. And she says, you know, girls, if you would do this for your father, he'll live for a very long time. Well, the daughters of Peleus are not magicians or not sorceresses like Medea, so all they get at the end of this is a boiled daddy. Clearly time to hightail it out of town again, which is what brings the happy couple, Jason and Medea, to exile in Corinth, where our tragedy opens. Here, a 20th century, early 20th century painting of the Argo fleeing and Medea throwing her pleading brother overboard. This one doesn't seem to capture the dismemberment part of it, but certainly the murder of her brother. And here on this Greek vase, you can see the trick of Medea, the magical trick of rejuvenating the old ram, thus fooling the daughters of Peleus into killing their father. With this mythological pedigree, it would have surprised it would not have surprised the Athenian audience that some ugly things were going to happen. Nor should it surprise us. These are characters who are inherently flawed. Jason himself is rather a weak hero, even in the other versions of the story of the Argo. He needs to be propped up all the time, and Medea is a dangerous sorceress. I'm going to jump towards the end of the play here just to focus us on the way Euripides gets inside the heart and the emotions of the character. At this moment, Medea has made up her mind to kill her children as a way of getting back at Jason. We'll talk a little bit more about the extraordinary maniacal rage that takes her to a place where she's willing to do something that obviously is a terrible crime, hurtful to her, just for the satisfaction of getting even with Jason. But notice the way she wavers. Goodbye to those plans I made. I will take my children away from Corinth with me. In bringing suffering on them to cause their father pain, why should I bring twice as much suffering on myself? Very good thinking, Medea. No, I shall not do it. Goodbye to my plans. And yet, what is the matter with me? Do I want to become a laughingstock by letting my enemies off scot-free? I must find it in me to do this thing. To think that I could have been so weak. Did I actually let myself be influenced by such cowardly thoughts? Off with you now, children, into the house. And give me your hands, children. Give your mother your hands to kiss. Oh, hands I love so much, dear, dear lips, my children, my pretty ones with your faces so noble. All happiness be yours, but not here. A conflicted, demonic, terrifying figure. nicely captured again in this version of this performance of the Medea that was done in San Antonio. Actress capturing on her face that mix of resolve, horror, and sorrow. So now that I've spoiled the ending for you, but you've read it anyway, at least I hope you've read it by now, and if you haven't, read it. Let's look at some of the key moments in the play and see how the action evolves. In the first line, the nurse explains the situation. Would that there had never been a voyage of the Argo, and she takes note of that rather untoward thing Medea did in persuading the daughters of Peleus to dismember their father. But they note that she endeavors to please her husband, who has now been a total rat and has betrayed her, and their children. Medea, in her sorrow and rage, invokes his oaths to her. She is beyond comfort. After all, what she did in Colchis meant that she could never go back, and she has given up her homeland, her family, for him. And he did swear to her that he would marry her, that he would not leave her, because she is, at this point, once she's done these things, he is the only sanctuary that she has. The nurse fears her rage, already adumbrating what's going to happen. I pray her victims may be enemies, not those who love her. The nurse senses that she's willing to do something desperate. Now the tutor of the children comes in and explains it's going to be yet worse. Not only is Medea betrayed by her husband, who's about to marry the daughter of the ruler of Corinth, but Medea and the children will be driven from Corinth. And Medea already says she wants the children to die with their father, or she gives the alternative, or she should die herself. We see the character already developing of unrestrained demonic rage. She bewails in a way that's really quite remarkable for 5th century Athens, a woman's lot, a dowry, the submission of her body to a man, no real possibility of divorce without disgrace. He has the freedom that she does not have. In other words, he can be as promiscuous as she wants, and the woman cannot. And then she utters a line that was rather notorious in antiquity: I would rather face the enemy 3 times over than bear a child once. This really is kind of remarkable on Euripides' part, to have this deep empathy in a society that was really so male-focused. And when we get to Thucydides, to the funeral oration that Pericles gives, we'll pause again on this issue of the role and status of women in ancient Greece. Medea realizes that she's particularly vulnerable because she's a foreigner in Corinth. And now Creon, the ruler, comes to tell her of the exile. He admits that he's afraid of her anger and her sorcery. She, sly woman that she is already setting up the revenge she's going to take, and begs for and gets a reprieve of 1 day. And he leaves saying that if she goes beyond 1 day, she will be put to death. She is plotting, as she says, I will make corpses of 3 enemies. In fact, it will be something much worse. Jason comes in, and it is a remarkable argument between the two. He is cold, he is slick, he is self-serving, he's disingenuous. He speaks more like a street attorney than somebody who ought to have some affection and some sense, indeed, even of guilt for what he's doing. But he tries to turn it on her. It's your fault. Because of your anger that you're getting exiled. And I was actually on your side. I was your advocate. The royal family wanted worse. I've got your best interests in heart. And of course, this is arrant nonsense. Medea does not let him get away with it, and she recounts the reasons he owes her loyalty. All of his success in gaining the golden fleece and escaping with his life getting revenge on Peleus, all this was due to her. And she is very clear about the fact that he swore oaths to her. Well, what's his response? Oh, I'd have to be a really good speaker to answer that, as if the whole thing is all about rhetoric. His arguments are outrageous. They're dastardly. He tells her only one person, human or divine, lent success to my voyage, and that was Aphrodite. Now, you do possess a shrewd mind, but it would be invidious to recount how love with his inescapable arrows compelled you to save my life. Now, this is a very Euripidean kind of thing to unpack a convention that, yes, we can't escape the arrows of Eros, that's the Greek name for the cute little cherub that we call Cupid. But there's something very outrageous about the way Jason is using this argument that you didn't do anything for me, you were just compelled by the arrows of Eros sent by Aphrodite. And it gets worse. Well, you actually got the better part of the bargain. You got to go to Greece. And you've come to a land where there's justice, not the rule of force. And you've become famous here. And by the way, I'm doing this for our children so that they'll have another family that will be even stronger. And then he goes on to say, it'd be so much better if men didn't need women to have children because you all are just so irrational. You're guided by your passions. And by the way, honey, I'll give you some cash for the trip. Medea, who has both dignity and pride, dignity perhaps eclipsed by her extraordinary rage, is having none of this. And she simply says, go away, go back to your new one bride. Don't disappoint your new honey. Meanwhile, however, she gets a rather providential visit, namely Aegeus of Athens. He will be the father or co-father of the Athenian hero Theseus. Poseidon had a little bit to do in the siring of the Athenian hero. And Aegeus has been to Delphi to consult Apollo because he's childless. And she then pours out her heart about Jason's betrayal and her banishment. And she begs him for sanctuary, slyly hinting that she, the skillful sorceress that she is, has powers to cure childlessness. She notes how fragile her position is. Peleus' family obviously has her on the most wanted list, and Creon has obviously already made her an exile. So she insists on an oath that under no circumstance will he ever give her up to her enemies. This gives her what she needs to implement a diabolical plan, not just killing Jason's bride, but then her own children. And the chorus bids her not to slay her own children, not to break mankind's laws. And so the dynamic of the play is beginning to shift. Whereas she was a highly sympathetic figure, the cast asunder bride of Jason, who's betrayed her, now we're beginning to get a sense of just how dangerous and how vicious she herself can be in her desire for revenge. As you could tell from a couple of those scenes that I showed you from modern theatrical performance, this is a figure that has captured the imagination since antiquity. Here, shortly after the Civil War, a marble carving by William Wetmore Story, now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Alas, none of us are taking a field trip there for a while. Here we see her with her dagger, ready to do this horrible deed. And now she is putting her plan in motion. She asks Jason to come, and she begs him for forgiveness. He shows his general patronizing attitude towards her and women. When when she begs that the children may remain in Corinth, she understands that she's got to leave. He is persuaded to intervene with his new bride and to secure their place in Corinth. So she sends some bridal gifts to sweeten her up with the children. And they deliver this hideous gift, a tiara and a gown smeared with a poison that will ensure an agonizing death. On the return of the children, she now agonizes over her own plan to kill them. A messenger quickly comes talking about the horrible death of the princess, who literally is eaten alive by this horrible poison. And when Creon sees her lying on the floor, he embraces her and she sticks to him, so he also dies in agony through the terrible poisons that Medea has. Medea, off stage, remember, no violence is done on stage, kills her children. You can hear their screams from behind the scene, from behind the set. Jason arrives intending to kill Medea, but in her dragon chariot sent by her grandfather, the sun, she mocks him. She says her pain over the children is cancelled by her pleasure in revenge, and she denies him the chance even to bury them. An extraordinary insight into the depths of vindictiveness. Such things, are they exaggerations? Well, we do see sometimes, horrible as it is to say, in situations of domestic violence, places where people ignore all basic decency and humanity. And it is this kind of phenomenon that Euripides is exploring and plumbing in this mythological story. This version, a modern retelling of Medea, just recently closed on Broadway. This is a story that we will see over and over again. And it's a reminder of what is a classic. It's something that continues to talk to people in different places, in different eras, in different ways. Something that gets us at the core of some aspect of human experience and compels us to think hard about who we are, what our values are, what society we live in. These are all the things that make a story truly a classic. The terrible scene of the child murder is, of course, captured in ancient art, not only in later evocations of it, although there are plenty. This one from a 4th century BCE vase. An engraving now in the Princeton Museum from the early 19th century of Medea effecting this horrible revenge on her husband by killing their children. 19th century French artist Eugène Victor Delacroix with much the same scene. And here on this late 5th century vase, we have Medea in her dragon chariot sent to her by her grandfather, the sun. Beneath her, to the left of the vase, you see the bodies of the children. In this version, clearly she's not taking them away with her in the chariot. Euripides has given us quite a chilling glimpse into human irrationality in the story of Medea. Although clearly a mythological story, a very ancient mythological story, he brings it home to us. He grips our hearts, terrorizes us in many ways by exploring the emotional motivations of Medea. And in the Hippolytus, the play that you read right after Medea, I'm not sure if you've gotten to this one yet, we see again this exploration of how people make choices. Some really wonderful lines here. We know what is right and we understand it, but we don't put it into practice, some out of laziness, others by letting some other pleasure come first, and life has many pleasures. And so also what the nurse says when she discovers the nature of Phaedra's passion. She's no goddess then, the Cyprian, that's Aphrodite, but something greater, call it what you will, bringing ruin on this woman, on me, and on this house. What an interesting unpacking of the story. Well, it's not just Aphrodite, it's something within us, something larger than even a goddess. And that's, again, one of the ways that Euripides invites us to think about what causality really is. The play opens, and it's going to give us the ultimate spoiler. We know exactly what's going to happen. We see an offended Aphrodite in her cruelest aspect. She notes, which is very true, that the gods and goddesses demand honor. They punish hubris or arrogance in human beings. And this, in one sense, is highly traditional, but the way the play will evolve gives us something that goes beyond just the simple tale of mortal hubris, mortal arrogance, and the punishment of the goddess. There's a certain cruelty about all of this. Aphrodite has made Phaedra fall in love with Hippolytus, and notes that her love has to have a different end. In other words, her destruction, because she says, I will not let the thought of her suffering rob me of the satisfaction of seeing my enemies punished. Much like what we saw in Medea's motivation. And again, a traditionalist could say, well, why does that surprise you? Gods and goddesses are touchy about their honor, and they will take vengeance. But remember that Euripides is writing in an era where some of the traditional concepts that had been very much at the core of Greek thinking are really being taken apart systematically by the philosophers, by the sophists. And here the idea of whether we can expect something of a higher plane from the gods and goddesses does come to the fore. And of course, Hippolytus is doing just about everything wrong in terms of negotiating, dealing with a goddess. He weaves a beautiful garland for Artemis from a virgin meadow. It's a very beautiful short speech that he gives. Mistress, for you I bring this garland I have woven. I fashioned it from flowers in a virgin meadow, where no shepherd dares to let his flocks graze, and the plowshare has not yet come. It is a pure meadow, and the bee passes over it in the spring. Reverence tends it with river water for all who have gained self-discipline in everything they do. No mortal man their tutor, but nature alone. Its flowers are for them to gather, while the wicked are prohibited. Dear mistress, permit a devoted hand to set this garland on your golden hair. It's really quite lovely, except when a wise servant bids Hippolytus to honor Aphrodite as well, he arrogantly and angrily rejects the suggestion. Thus, he really is, in a very traditional way, setting himself up for divine punishment. And going back to that phrase that we looked at the beginning, God should be wiser than men. The servant, the slave, when Hippolytus rejects a suggestion to pay some honor to Aphrodite, says, well, I'll make my prayers to your statue, Lady Cypris, speaking as a slave should, for we shouldn't imitate young folk when this is what's in their head. Forgiveness is what we need. If someone in the heat of youth says foolish things about you, pretend not to hear him. God should be wiser than men. That, of course, is an illusion in this play. So we meet poor Phaedra, who is the wife of Theseus and the stepmother to Hippolytus. She's in a state of physical and mental collapse and says that she wants to become a devotee of Artemis. And she has a strong sense of shame, while the nurse is already suggesting some kind of concession is all right, by saying a life of strict, unswerving conduct more often leads to failure. We're already getting a sense that the nurse is going to be manipulative and unreliable. Phaedra does not want in any way to divulge that she's in love with her stepson, in any way to shame the bed of Theseus, even in thinking about it. And she recalls that she is of cursed lineage. Her mother is Pasiphae, who was cursed with a monstrous lust for a bull, and Daedalus, the great artificer, built a wooden cow so that she could be inside and coupled with the bull. It's a rather horrifying myth. And what comes out of that union is the Minotaur, which we'll study about a little later on in the term. So we have Pasiphae, and her two daughters are Phaedra and her sister Ariadne, who will become the unhappy bride of Dionysus. So by line 350, she reveals her love for Hippolytus, but she is really heroic in her resistance. Silence when that doesn't work, self-discipline when that doesn't work, she resolves on death. The nurse turns into some kind of procuress, some kind of bawd, and says to her, well, the gods get involved in all kinds of sexual misconduct. Phaedra is having none of this. Phaedra is really quite resolute in not accepting the nurse's rhetoric, her sly words trying to persuade her to do something that she knows to be wrong. But then the nurse deceives her and says, if I just have a lock of hair from the guy, I can make some love charm so you won't be in love with him anymore. And poor Phaedra believes that this is what's happening. But in fact, what the nurse did was to go and see if she could be the go-between for Hippolytus and Phaedra, and told the young man that she's desperately in love with him. And the two of them come forth from the skene, from the backdrop, and the nurse is begging him, no, don't say anything about it. You swore to me. And Hippolytus says, my tongue swore, but not my heart. Another rather notorious line. But he makes clear he will remain by his oath. He's not going to betray the secret of Phaedra. But then he pours out just the most appalling misogyny, this curse on all women. This, of course, becomes great comic material for Aristophanes, particularly in a play called the Thesmophoria Zeusai, the women at the Thesmophoria festival. But Phaedra still fears that he will reveal her secret and disgrace her, and she resolves on her death and a snare for Hippolytus. She writes a suicide note in which she claims that he raped her, and that this is what caused her to hang herself. So Theseus invokes the curse of his father Poseidon. When he confronts Hippolytus, who is not a slick speaker, gives a truthful but really quite wooden defense. It doesn't go anywhere. How could you think that of me? I'm a virgin. I would never do such a thing. I'm not even interested in that. And Theseus just accuses him of being a hypocrite. So Hippolytus goes off into exile, a lethal curse upon him. Poseidon sends a monstrous bull from the sea, and it causes Hippolytus' horses to go mad. They bolt, and he falls out of the chariot. He's dragged by the stampeding horses until he's just barely alive, all tangled up in the reins. Here a painting by Sir Lawrence Alma Tadema of Hippolytus being dragged to his death. The boy is brought to his father, bleeding and dying, and Theseus at first is quite cold about this because he feels that his son has wronged him in such a horrible way. But then Artemis appears, Dea ex machina. In other words, the actor is hoisted in a kind of a crane above the action of the stage and tells him the terrible truth. And argues that Theseus offended both her and Poseidon by his rashness in not really investigating the case properly. But she's really giving very cold comfort as Hippolytus lies there dying. And she explains, we gods have a law, none seeks to oppose the settled purpose of another. There's no joy in heaven when God-fearing men die. But she's not going to break the protocol. So she lets all this happen to her beloved Hippolytus. And Hippolytus, as he dies, let me back up. Artemis says, it's not right for a goddess to be there as a mortal dies, which of course is not really true, certainly not in the Homeric world. But Hippolytus says to her, how easily, in Greek, hosrea, you leave your companion of so many hunts. Typically that phrase is used of how easily gods do extraordinary things, lift mountains or whatever. But here it's emotional, how easy it is for you to leave your companion. I want to come back to that point in a moment. Where are we as mortals in this world? It's a question that we've had to ask of the Oresteia, with Aeschylus's really strong focus on human progress. It's a question that we've asked with some terror and despair of Sophocles in the Oedipus Rex. Where do we turn in this world that's so opaque, where we are so fragile? And here we're capturing this in a different way. Oh, Artemis, how easily you leave your companion of so many hunts. Hippolytus feels pity for his father, whose curse has killed him, and with great nobility absolves him of guilt. So the play ends with a human reconciliation, the reconciliation of father and son. Hold that point where the gods have not been helpful. Human beings can offer themselves some way of surviving the catastrophe. But one more point about this very uncomforting world that mortals move in the backdrop of gods and goddesses of ancient Greece. Artemis is going to have her revenge. Not even in the darkness of earth below shall it go unpunished, this willful anger of the goddess Cypris, that's Aphrodite, that attacks your body. This much I owe to your piety and righteous heart. With these unerring arrows shot from this hand, I will take revenge on another, one of hers, whatever man she loves most on earth. Well, WWAS, what would Aeschylus say? I'm posing this in a kind of mischievous way, but what we saw in the Oresteia was that a law court in Athens on the Areopagus could solve problems that the gods themselves couldn't solve. And here we're back in that world of irrationality, where Aphrodite has her nose out of joint. Traditionally, that's what would happen with gods and goddesses that feel offended. Nothing particularly surprising about that. And Artemis has a non-intervention policy. And furthermore, she leaves her favorite easily because it's just not kosher for her to be around as a man dies. But she's going to get even. And some innocent mortal whom Aphrodite loves is going to die for it. Ponder these thoughts. One of the things I so cherish about Greek literature is that it doesn't make it easy for us. when it asks us to confront the opacity, the irrationality, the terror of human existence, the fragility of the mortal condition. It doesn't give us pap. It doesn't give us sugar-coated answers. It really forces us into confrontation with the question of who we are and what we can do. And although we will not read this play, the Heracles, written approximately the same time as the Medea, I want to focus on some very, very striking lines. Heracles has been utterly devastated by the anger of Hera. He's been driven mad. In his madness, he's killed his wife. He's killed his children. We see him on stage spattered with the most horrible of pollution, the blood of his own family. And Theseus comes to him and says, I'm taking you to Athens to purify you of this blood guilt. And Heracles says, get away from me. I'm so polluted. And Theseus says, friends cannot pollute their friends. And when Theseus tries to comfort him by saying, just as the nurse in the Hippolytus did, well, the gods get into the wrong beds too, so and they, beat each other up. Why are you being so hard on yourself? Heracles shouts out at him, "Per erga mentad esti ton emon kakon," in Greek. Alas, all these arguments are irrelevant to the evils that I suffer. I don't think that gods crave beds unlawful for them, or ever threw chains on the hands of other gods. I don't believe such things, or that one of them lords it over another. A god, if he's a god, needs none of this. These are the miserable words of poets. How remarkable in this piece of poetry, this Greek tragedy, to have the character so clearly questioning all of those concepts of divinity, of the justice of Zeus, the justice of the gods. But what are we left with? And picture this. Theseus, in his clean robes, walks over and picks up Heracles, lying on the ground, devastated, spattered with blood, that would by nature have had to smear onto the costume of Theseus. Theseus saying, you cannot pollute me. I can get no miasma because you are my friends. Thus we are offered a vision, and this is a vision that I believe is so important for understanding the great Greek miracle of the 5th century, that we have that capacity to make progress. We have the capacity within us to be rational, to understand better. And that is a great legacy that the Greeks gave us. This is one of the things that we need to cherish and build upon.